This is San Francisco.
Clinton Park is a short street on the edge of the Castro and the Mission, which is lined with classic Victorian homes, a staple of San Francisco design and architecture, as we all know. Another San Francisco staple is hostel architecture. Hostel architecture is hostile to anyone who wants to sit down. So think, benches with 3 rails in the middle of them so you can't lay down on them. That's an example of hostile architecture. Hostile architecture tends to be hostile to homeless people who might linger or sleep on the sidewalk of a road like Clinton Park. And so tonight we're going to talk about how some large stone boulders mysteriously appeared on Clinton Park, some hostile architecture, and how they were paid for by mid-level tech bros. This is part 1 of a series about how neighborhoods are colonized using defensive or hostile architecture. I'm Toshio, and I would love to welcome back to the podcast, Christen, Cioffi.
Hello, it's me. Thank you for having me.
In September 2019, 25 large stone boulders about the size of overstuffed beanbags appeared on the sidewalk lining Clinton Park alley. And immediately, people who drove, walked, or biked down Clinton Park had questions as to the source of the boulders. And they took to social media and old media as well to pose the question of where these boulders came from. SF Public Works Department spokesperson Rachel Gordon told NBC, quote, "We really don't know how the boulders got here," end quote, and speculated that they might qualify as illegal dumping. It was weeks of internet speculation before a neighbor snitched on themselves to KTVU Fox Channel 2. There'd been a fundraiser, it turned out, by the property owners. It soon came out that on GoFundMe, neighbors on Clinton Park had collected about $2,000 for 25 boulders, which were installed in the dark of night.
What blows my mind here is that they literally snitched on themselves. They needed the people to know that they were literally part of this initiative to raise money on a GoFundMe to put giant rocks on a sidewalk to prevent people from being there, just existing. They had to let people know, specifically Fox, which is a choice, but whatever.
They were happy to own up to it. They were kind of stoked on themselves. Immediately, tons of people who hate homeless people were cheering them on, and plenty of people who saw the cruelties in the boulders spoke out as well. There were a bunch of protesters that showed up to Clinton Park. This was like a month saga that we're about to recount. Protesters came together drinking Rolling Rock, which I and others may know as the beer in the green bottle that is not Heineken, in protest of these boulders,
so
the rocks.
Cute. Roll the rocks.
Yeah, it gave them the power. The beer gave them the power to pick up these rocks and roll them into the street. There was a Craigslist post from the anti-boulder side, the side of the protesters, by Twitter user Danielle Baskin that went viral. She had put the rocks in the free section of Craigslist. Her post coincided with the Clinton Park homeowners realizing their own kind of lack of geology knowledge, because the stones were really not very heavy, hence the ability of the protesters to roll them back onto the street.
That's a lie. It was all the Rolling Rock. It's a lie. It was the Rolling Rock.
Yeah, perhaps it was the beer. They spent the $2,000 on these rocks that were easily tipped onto the street by passersby. I'm not going to lie and say that I am at all sympathetic to the homeowners. I am fully on the side of the protesters who are irritated that here was another example of why San Francisco is a pain in the ass, not only if you are houseless, but if you get around in a wheelchair, or you're disgusted by the privilege of certain newcomers. They now wanted the city to remove them using city workers and city-owned cranes. And the corrupt Department of Public Works was happy to oblige. Christen, would you mind reading the UK Guardian's account?
So in the UK Guardian's account, quote, one Clinton Park resident who asked not to be named stood across from the sidewalk in question, which, for the moment, was clear of any encampments or activity. He was supportive of the boulders, though he wanted planters, quote, because people do view the boulders as hostile, unquote. I thought this was kind of, I mean, it's not funny, but like, I thought it was kind of fucking hilarious that they were totally cool with these planters. And they openly acknowledge that these boulders are hostile architecture. But like, because it's like flowers, right? Like that, like the flowers aren't making it even more like inaccessible or not a tangible symbol of displacement by any means, because they're flowers. They're flowers. They're not rocks.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's less in your face for sure than, spikes. Like, interesting that we have spikes on the Victorian houses and even outside my house right now in Civic Center, there's like the spikes for pigeons. So the pigeons can't land. But they made these like gigantic, basically like spikes for humans.
They look like maces that are like flat. Well, they're not flat because they're spikes, but like, like they are just literally a bed of spikes.
Yeah. And so like you can't sit or stand under any eaves. You can't like be out there under an alcove to like get some reprieve from the rain. I know that is just like a very obvious example. And these boulders, I guess, are supposed to blend in a little bit more and be a little more aesthetically pleasing.
I mean, like, I don't know of any place that uses rocks as a form of, like exterior design other than like the boonies in Arizona. So I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like they are not super expensive and they do block roads to the effect of like not making it accessible. But San Francisco, we are a city where tech bros have unironically suggested apps to solve homelessness. And that usually involves putting a ton of funding into some startup that no one asked for, in particular apps promoted by venture capitalist Ron Conway, who lives in the city. He is behind SF.City, C-I-T-I, SF.City, and they rolled out an app shortly before the Clinton Park saga. And the city, SF City app was supposed to connect homeless people with local shelters, but then ended up just connecting them with police because police were the first ones to get called. No, I can't say that I am, unfortunately. So thanks for nothing, Ron Conway. The neighbors cried that even though nobody had been hurt and there hadn't been any home break-ins as a result of homeless people staying on Clinton Park, that, just to use San Francisco Chronicle columnist Heather Knight's oft-repeated term, open-air drug markets were a scandalous occurrence that was happening on Clinton Park, and they, couldn't deal. And, we're living in a time where thousands of people end up on shelter wait lists. Like, I know, Christen, you used to work at one of the sites where people were staying during COVID. And so, like, this was just before COVID, but the housing situation was very much same as today. I mean, there's just thousands and thousands of people who don't have a place to stay. Like, they call it coordinated entry.
So basically, just really quick, coordinated entry is a literal hotline. It is a number that the city gives out to all sorts of nonprofits all over the city, usually related to housing. And they give these people these hotlines that they have to call over and over and over again to maybe, hopefully, possibly usually not, be directed to some form of housing. And often those look like, the lotteries. And the thing that people don't think about with these lotteries is that you have literally thousands of people applying to like a super small number of, if they're lucky, below market rate, but usually they're not. They're very expensive. They're still very expensive, units. So, you have all of these people that are on these wait lists, all of these people using coordinated entry. So many people have already been through the system. So many people are disillusioned by it, rightfully so, and don't trust it. And it often ends up hurting people or not even getting them housed to begin with.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's ridiculous that so even these wait lists, like you're on the wait list for what you hope in the end, maybe down the road could get you into permanent housing. But we have wait lists for even the shelters, which is not anything like a home. In many cases, you can't bring like your dog. You have like a limited amount of space. And people, it's not like you go to these places and everyone's stoked to see you. It's like they're exhausted because if you work in one of these places, it's like, I mean, it's a thankless job. And also, in some cases, I think it attracts like people that like to power trip.
100%. 100% on that.
Yeah. And so, yeah, people end up on these wait lists. Like, I don't know, I was going to mention like the safe injection sites that there's one that's still open in town in Soma. And these are places where people can go if, like Heather Knight, the Chronicle columnist who loves to talk about open air drug markets just being everywhere and threatening lives all the time, threatening the gentrifiers' lives, that is. She's like, the same kind of person that would call for the shutting down of a safe injection site, which is a place that people can temporarily go, be in a safe place where they can have access to like a clean needle and stuff. Like people are going to do drugs regardless because you're not giving them jobs that are going to pay for them to even be able to rent an apartment. It just seems like the bare minimum. But they did close down one of these places recently. And that sucks. But, like this is all in a scheme where like in the city, there's over 20 empty but unaffordable homes or condos for every homeless person. So capitalism. And again, like people were pushing the boulders back onto the street. And 3 times this happened. And each of those times, Department of Public Works would bring out whole cranes, like heavy machinery, and put the boulders back onto the sidewalk.
Wait. Hold on. So this was this was going on for a month and people were, rolling them off, rightfully so, as they should. And DPW would use cranes to put them back on the sidewalk.
Yes. Yeah.
They're not even like from the city. They said it was like illegal dumping. Like, what the hell?
Right. I know. I love that. However, after 3 times of putting the boulders back onto the sidewalk, decided it was over it. Mohammed Nuru, who was the head of the Department of Public Works at the time when asked about the situation, doubled down. Very Trumpian figure without any of the, I guess you could call it charisma that Trump has. But he doubled down saying the boulders weren't big enough. So maybe the city should consider putting in bigger boulders. Nuru, of course, does not reside in San Francisco at the moment because he lives in a federal prison. Briefly, listeners probably know some combination of these stories, but Nuru is famous locally as not only the Department of Public Works and ex of the current mayor, London Breed, and also the ex of San Francisco's own Rachel Dolezal, the CEO of the private policing organization, Urban Alchemy. Lena Sum?
He is ran through
Yep,
completely.
pretty much. He's also famous. I like the anecdote about how briefly before he was charged during this FBI sting that ended up in prison, he is famous locally for holding up a Marin food bank worker at knife point in order to steal some Doritos. You know, the department that he ran, the Department of Public Works, is so corrupt and so brazenly corrupt that the FBI was like, we need to do a sting around this corruption. Is corruption. He considered himself part of this local mafia that still exists at City Hall where people have blackmail material on each other and they trade Rolexes, but usually like much less expensive things like $300 gift cards for political favors and city contracts that literally involve Recology, which is the local recycling company. The family on The Sopranos famously ran a waste management company, and Nuru's San Francisco gang fancies itself like The Sopranos, but in a post-diversity, equity, inclusion world.
I don't think you could have worded that any better. I've never really thought about it like in connection with The Sopranos. It's very good. This is still on the topic of Nuru, but I just want to say I've always wanted to know what his day looked like when he held up that Marin food bank worker. I just want to know how he got to that point.
It's like the day of someone, I'm sure, who is just like, oh, like I already have the world in my hands in a certain way. Obviously, that can change in an instant, as we saw from the FBI sting.
But I need those Doritos, man. I need the Doritos.
I do love a knife point stick up. And we are a gun-free city here, apart from the cops, of course.
I've always pictured it as a butter knife.
But yeah, the people behind the fundraiser were the new neighbors, of course. And they're a perfect example of how whatever you want to call them, Karens, when they can't speak to a manager, they will go out of their way to get rid of people who'd been there for long before them, including people who were houseless and had been staying on Clinton Park on and off, and leave the city worse than you found it. I remember at the time, people were kind of passing around the names of people who had been participating in the fundraiser to raise money for the Boulders. And they included just the most cliche tech bro types that had just come to San Francisco, descended upon it to be like vultures. Timothy Kettering was one of the people that lived in the Victorians on Clinton Park. He, at the time, was working for Lyft and then Twitter more recently, working to make Twitter, quote unquote, accessible to everyone. He was cut from Twitter shortly after Elon Musk entered the office on Market Street last fall, and Twitter became one of these companies that in tech recently is just having rounds and rounds of layoffs. If people want to check him out and say hello, he is at Timmy Twits, TWITS, and his profile asserts that he'll always be a quote-unquote tweet, despite no longer being with the company. Another person that people were passing the name around of was Ms. Alina Abrahamian of Calm.com Inc. That's CALM.com. She was also part of the vigilante mob who initially refused to take responsibility for the mysterious appearance of the Boulders. She was a divorcee, Alina, who put all her energy into being a social media maven for brands like Del Monte, Fruit, Starbucks, and Pine Sol before she landed the role of head of strategic partnerships at Calm, and ostensibly used its app and channeled leftover energy into a grassroots campaign to make the lives of homeless people harder in San Francisco. Christen, are you familiar with the Calm app?
I am totally familiar with the app. I personally don't use it, and I don't know if I can ever say I would, although the thought of having Matthew McConaughey whisper sweet nothings in my ear doesn't sound horrible, but I won't willingly seek it. I just really liked True Detective season 1. Like, if we're going to be totally real.
That's perfectly acceptable. Calm is indeed an app that helps you meditate and sleep while listening to mantras that are spoken by celebrities like Matthew McConaughey and Harry Styles. Let's see. I saw Kate Winslet on there. It's got a lot of money behind it. It is this app that's positioning itself as a cheap way for insurance companies to basically avoid having to pay for therapy. It's using AI and a technique it calls literary cloning to create some of the bedtime stories in its app, which is kind of creepy. Calm received about $100K in taxpayer cash to ease the nerves of congressional staffers after the January 6th, 2021 attacks in DC. And it recently acquired a biotech medical startup soon after its valuation was placed at $2 billion by investors.
No.
Yeah. So thank you, Alina Abrahamian, who, she's not that special. She's just kind of like an ideal colonizing figure in this microcosm of San Francisco gentrification. She wasn't in San Francisco for long in total, a couple of years, and she saw homeless people as a temporary inconvenience, clearly, while she was girl bossing her way through Silicon Valley. She moved back to London about a year after the Clinton Park Boulder controversy to go work for Calm's London offices.
Doing the Lord's work.
She arrived in the neighborhood in between the Castro and the Mission. She clearly saw something she didn't want to see and fundraised for literal rocks to end human life existing in public space outside of her door. Without Alina, who knows if we would be relating this story to you, because I think it probably helped to have a marketing department girl at the tech company to get this campaign off the ground, because marketing continues to be one of the few departments where girl bosses can flourish at tech companies, despite all of the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you. She is at LEENIBEANS on Instagram if you want to say hello. And she's also on Etsy. So a few of the neighbors pointedly did not agree with the Boulders. One, Alan Walton, said his new Boulder fundraising neighbors had at points deceived the rest of the neighbors, giving an excuse, quote, "They're to make everything look nicer." To which Alan said, "No, it's to try and keep homeless people away. And if they're going to do it, be truthful about it," end quote. So, even ostensibly, this is an older neighbor who's been there for a while and wasn't a total asshole like Leanie Beans or Timmy Twips. So Alan Walton, was less potentially of an asshole, admonishing his neighbors who were basically trying to conceal the fact that they didn't want to see poverty around. NBC Bay Area spoke to Daniel Bartosiewicz, who camped along Clinton Park for 2 months. And he said the aggrieved neighbors never reached out to him beforehand, although one reportedly spoke with him after this NBC Bay Area interview. Quote, "They would have saved a lot of money and a lot of trouble if they just said something to us. Use your compassion and love and understanding. We are humans," said Bartosiewicz.
One thing about these kinds of neighbors is that they probably won't talk to you. They will just make your life hell from behind closed doors. And if you take anything away from this episode, just talk to your neighbors. I mean, you don't have to talk to the shitty ones all the time, but
I would have to agree with that statement. The city of San Francisco, however, might disagree. It continues to not do right by people who live here, whether they're houseless or whether they're precariously housed, as you may have seen it named as people who are just making enough to pay the rent. But if their landlords ever decided to raise the rent, there's a lot of people who would be out on the streets. There's like a sort of expectation that at the shelters that the city does have is like, here, we're going to give you this cot or bed. Now get your shit together, get a job, rent an apartment. But in SF, you would have to work about 5 full-time minimum wage jobs to afford a typical apartment. And shelters tend to be an excuse for the city to give these, huge contracts for like building a shelter or managing a shelter to private companies and their nonprofit arms as well. Like a Mohammed Nuru might give to a friend like Lena Sum at Urban Alchemy. And it's sad when people who they're not even on the receiving end of a government contract, have no imagination beyond something like Iraq.
Literally none to be found that are just so down to make people's days and like literal lives harder. Like, you call obviously like we don't, but like you call the cops on your neighbors. Like you're not just, like quote unquote, like addressing like a disturbance of some kind. You are literally seeking a violent form, of police, just onto people that, very well, SFPD kills people every day. Like these people know what they're doing. Yeah.
Just a lot of people without any humanity.
Don't do it.
All right. Well, we're going to bring you some more tales of defensive and hostile architecture by people who ostensibly should know better, except for there seems to be an empty black hole where their hearts should be. I hope to see Christen again in San Francisco very soon. In the meantime, where can people follow you, Christen?
Check out my unsolicited opinions on SF local politics and honestly just a bunch of bullshit. You can follow me on Twitter, which is at JFChrist_. So J like Jesus, F like fuck, Christ like also like Jesus, underscore, or on my Instagram at Brim with 2 M's _Weeper. Or you can go to my website and I can ignore you there, which is chvav.com.
See you next time here in San Francisco.